The bone folder had belonged to Josiah Hartley for 30 years before it belonged to no one, and on the morning they buried him, Eleanor Hartley stood at the lip of the grave, with it closed inside her fist. The smooth curve of it fitted so exactly to her palm that she did not know, until the sexton cleared his throat a second time, that she had been pressing the nicked corner into her thumb, hard enough to leave a mark. The church at Wren's Cross smelled of damp stone and old tallow, and, beneath both, of the lavender someone had scattered on the coffin lid, and the September heat outside had not broken in 11 weeks, so that the grass under her shoes was the colour of old paper and just as dry. She did not cry. She had promised herself, walking down from the bindery that morning, with her father's tool still warm from its place beside the hearth, that she would not cry in front of Silas Crane. And Silas Crane was there, 3 rows back, in a coat the exact grey of a headstone, watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man totting a column of figures. "Mend it and don't read it," her father used to say of a damaged page, handing her the folder before she was tall enough to reach the workbench without a stool. "A mended thing remembers where it broke, and you are not the one who gets to decide it should forget." She had thought, at 11, that he meant paper. She would spend a great deal of the following year discovering how wrong she had been. The debt came to light 3 days after the funeral, in Crane's office above the Corn Exchange, in the shape of a document he laid on the desk between them, with the flat, regretful courtesy of a man delivering news he had had no hand in making. £80, he said, and did not look up from smoothing the paper's corner with 2 fingers. "Your father's bond against materials, and rent these 6 years past, and I am afraid, Miss Hartley, that it does not die with him." She had read the figure twice, certain it was a misprint, the way one is certain a wasp will not sting until it does. "My father kept his books cleaner than any man in this town," she said. Crane's smile arrived the way it always did, half a second before it reached his eyes, and left half a second after they had already gone flat and grey again. "Grief does that to a man's arithmetic," he said. "I do not enjoy this. There is, however, a kindness in it, if you will let me offer it." Ashcombe Hall's muniment room flooded in the spring storms, papers going back 4 generations, ruined past any clerk's mending, and I am charged with setting it right before my Michaelmas. A bookbinder's daughter, trained at her father's own bench, could work off such a debt in a 12-month, boarded at the Hall, respectable, useful, or I could take the £80 in the ordinary way, which would mean the bindery, the lease, and your good name in the same week. He folded his hands. "It is not a hard choice, is it?" It was not a hard choice. It was, she understood even then, no choice whatsoever, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference sat in her chest like a swallowed stone the whole ride out to the Hall, 2 days later in the carrier's cart. Her father's tools wrapped in oilcloth on her knee, the folder loose in her apron pocket, where her thumb found the familiar nick, without her telling it to. Mrs. Prudence Bramwell met her at the kitchen door of Ashcombe Hall, with a candle, a suspicious squint, and an opinion, all 3 offered before Eleanor had both feet over the threshold. "So you're the paper doctor," Bramwell said, holding the candle up to Eleanor's face as though checking a coin for shaving. "Small hands. Good small hands don't tear what they're mending. Mind you wipe your feet. Mind you eat what's put in front of you. And mind you never once let that man upstairs catch you reading past the line he's drawn for you. Because he draws lines the way other men draw breath, without noticing he's doing it." Eleanor asked which man she meant. "There's only one who signs for anything in this house," Bramwell said, "and it isn't the Duke, seeing as nobody this side of the county has clapped eyes on the Duke since he was 21, more's the pity, for by all report he had his mother's manners and his father's sense, which is a rarer combination in that family than you'd think. She did not explain further. She led Eleanor instead down a corridor that smelled of beeswax, and beneath it of the particular mineral cold of stone that has not seen full sun in 200 years, and left her at the door of a room stacked to the cornices with boxes of swollen, water-stained ledgers, a single high window letting in a blade of white September light across a workbench someone had, with unexpected tenderness, already fitted out with a proper binder's press. Eleanor set her father's folder down on the bench, squared it to the edge the way he had taught her, and understood, looking at the mountain of ruined paper waiting for her hands, that whatever else this year cost her, it would not be idleness. She did not yet understand what else it would cost. That evening, told there was a harvest fair in the village 2 days hence, and that Bramwell expected her to attend it, whatever her mourning, because a girl who does not show her face in a new place is a girl the place decides things about behind her back, Eleanor said she had no wish to be looked at. Bramwell only laughed, not unkindly, and said that not wishing to be looked at had never once, in the history of the world, stopped anybody from being looked at, and that Eleanor had best decide what she wanted them to see instead. It was the kind of remark Eleanor would remember later as the first sign, small as a hairline crack in old varnish, that the world she had just been sold into was not going to hold still and behave the way Crane's smooth grey paper said it would. Wren's Cross on fair day smelled of scorched sugar and horse and, underneath, of the river running low and warm over its stones, and the sky over the green had the white, spent look of a summer that had gone on a fortnight too long. Eleanor had meant to keep to the edges of it, mend her mourning with quiet the way she mended paper, but the crowd had other ideas, carrying her past the cider stall and the ribbon stall and a man selling tin whistles before she had decided to move at all. She saw Thomas Whitlock across the green before he saw her, and her stomach did the small treacherous thing it had always done at the sight of him since they were 14, before she remembered that whatever there had been between them had gone quiet the same month her father's shop began to fail. Quiet in the specific, apologetic way of a friendship a family has decided, without saying so. To discourage. He was not alone. The woman on his arm wore a spencer the colour of a plum, and laughed at something with her whole throat, and Thomas, catching sight of Eleanor over the woman's bright bonnet, went the particular still that a man goes when he has been caught somewhere he told himself he had a right to be. He did not come over. He inclined his head, the smallest possible amount, the kind of bow that costs nothing and gives nothing, and Eleanor felt the old grief and a new, sharper one arrive together, and beneath both, unaccountably, a flare of something that was not grief at all, but plain wounded pride, hot as the cider stall coals. She was still standing there, working her father's folder between her fingers inside her pocket, when she became aware of a man beside her at the cider stall, watching the same small performance with the mild, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere in particular to be. He was tall, plainly coated, his boots better made than his coat, which she noticed the way she noticed everything, without yet knowing what it meant. He is going to look over here again in about 4 seconds, she thought, watching Thomas's woman steer him by the elbow toward the dancing, and I am going to have to smile as though none of it signifies. She did not decide to speak. The words arrived ahead of her sense, the way water finds the crack in a jug before you know the jug is cracked. "Kiss me," she said, to a complete stranger, so that man over there thinks I haven't a care in the world." The stranger turned his head slowly, and for one full second said nothing at all, and in that second she had time to regret it entirely. Then his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something drier and more careful than that. "That is a considerable request to make of a man whose name you don't have," he said. She had not thought that far ahead. "I don't need your name," she said. "I need your cooperation, and your discretion after, since I have just made an idiot of myself, and would rather not compound it by telling you why." He looked past her, once, toward Thomas and the woman in plum, and something moved behind his eyes that she would only understand much later to have been recognition of an old, familiar shape of unfairness, the kind a man notices when he has been on the losing end of a room's opinion himself. Then he set down his cup. He did not ask again, which she would remember afterward as the correct thing to have done, and he did not make a show of it for the benefit of the green, which she would also remember. The kiss itself was brief and warm, and entirely too competent for a man she had accosted at a cider stall, and when it ended he stepped back half a pace and studied her face with a frankness that made her want to look at her own shoes. "Well," he said, "I hope he was watching." "I don't much care whether he was," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither of them said so, which she would also, much later, understand to be the first true thing that passed between them. He told her his name was Julian Ash. She told him hers, and watched him turn it over the way a man turns over a coin to check the date, and he said, gravely, that Hartley was a name he had heard somewhere lately, in a tone that suggested he could not place where, and changed the subject before she could ask him to try harder. They walked, without either of them proposing it, along the river path where the crowd thinned to nothing, and he asked her what had brought a bookbinder's daughter to a fair she plainly hadn't wanted to attend, and she found herself telling him more than she had told Bramwell, more than she had told anyone, about the bond and the £80, and the year she now owed a man she had never once seen unhappy. He listened the way some men listen when they are waiting for their turn to speak, and other men listen the way a wall listens, absorbing everything and giving nothing back, and he was neither of those. He asked 2 questions, both of them the right ones. "Does the sum match his own account of your father's dealings?" he asked, "or only his word for it?" And when she admitted she had never seen the original bond, only Crane's fair copy of it, something crossed his face too quickly for her to read, gone before she could ask after it. She asked, in turn, what brought a gentleman of evident means to stand at a cider stall in Wren's Cross, in a coat too plain for his boots. "Business," he said. "That requires me to see a place as it actually is, rather than as it is dressed up to look when someone important is expected." "That is a curious kind of business," she said. "It is the only kind worth doing," he said, and did not elaborate, and she let it go, because the light was failing gold over the water, and Thomas Whitlock and his plum-coloured companion belonged, for the length of that walk, to another and much smaller life. When they came back within sight of the lanterns, he bowed over her hand with a correctness that did not match his coat at all, said he hoped their paths would cross again, and was gone into the crowd before she thought to ask where he lodged. She did not learn until 3 days later, standing in the hall's great hall, with her arms full of ruined ledgers, exactly how right he had been to guess her father's bond might not add up the way Crane's fair copy of it claimed, and she certainly did not learn, not for a good while yet, that the man who had kissed her at the cider stall to spare her pride had walked back to Ashcombe Hall that same night, and let himself in through his own front door. The morning she first understood how thoroughly the ground had shifted under her began ordinarily enough, with 41 water-stained pages spread to dry across the muniment room's one good table, and Bramwell's voice in the corridor announcing that the family was at breakfast and the new gentleman had arrived to look over the accounts, which meant, Bramwell added, that Eleanor was to keep to her room and not go wandering where she might be seen with ink on her hands. Eleanor had never yet been permitted to see the family at all, and she said as much, and Bramwell gave her the look she reserved for questions she considered beneath answering, and went away down the passage still talking. It was Silas Crane who found her instead, an hour later, standing over the table, with his hands clasped behind his back, in the manner of a man inspecting livestock. "You are making progress," he said, which was not a question, and she said that she was, and did not mention that 3 of the pages she had lifted free of their mould that morning bore dates, and a hand that troubled her in a way she could not yet name, a boldness of ink where the surrounding decades had faded to brown, as though someone had written last winter in a book that claimed to have been closed for 11 years. Crane leaned over her shoulder to look, and she felt him go very still beside her, the stillness of a man recalculating a sum in his head, and then he straightened and said, pleasantly, that damp did strange things to old iron-gall ink, drawing some pigments forward and leaving others, and that she should not trouble her head over the chemistry of it, only the mending. "Mend it," he said, "and don't read it," in words so exactly her father's that her breath caught, and she understood, watching him walk away with his hands still clasped behind him, that he had not chosen those words by accident, that he had somewhere heard them said before, perhaps by the very man he had bled dry for £80. That was the day she met Cordelia Crane, Silas Crane's niece, a bright, restless girl of 19, who found her way into the muniment room under the pretext of borrowing a paper knife, and stayed an hour, perched on the edge of the drying table with her slippers swinging, chattering about the house party the dowager was expected to hold once the harvest was in, and about a gentleman investor her uncle had lately taken a great liking to, a Mr. Ashe, plainly rich, plainly unattached, whom Uncle Silas meant to have to dinner 3 times a week, until the matter settled itself one way or another. Eleanor's needle stopped in the page she was resewing. "Mr. Ashe," she said, carefully, "is staying at the Hall." Cordelia said of course he was. Where else would a gentleman of business stay while he looked over an investment, and asked with the particular unkindness of the very young whether Eleanor had ever been kissed, because she herself had not, and thought it must be dreadfully overrated, given how little the men of her acquaintance seemed capable of saying anything sensible afterward. Eleanor said she supposed it depended entirely on the man, and offered nothing further, and sat with the knowledge sitting cold and strange in her chest for the rest of the afternoon, that the stranger who had kissed her at the cider stall to spare her pride was, at that very hour, very possibly down the same corridor, eating Silas Crane's dinner and hearing Silas Crane's account of his own. Honesty. She did not have to wait long to test it. He came to the muniment room himself 2 evenings later, ostensibly to ask after the progress of the accounts he claimed an interest in, and stood in the doorway with the particular carefulness of a man who has rehearsed an entrance, and is not entirely satisfied with it. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Mr. Ashe," she said back, and let the 2 words sit there between them with all their unspoken weight, and watched him have the grace to look, for just a moment, genuinely uncertain of his footing, a rare enough sight in a man so composed that she found herself almost sorry for him. "I did not lie to you at the fair," he said. "I only failed to mention that my business happened to bring me here. That is a very fine distinction," she said, "for a man to draw." "It is the only kind of distinction men in my position are ever permitted," he said, and something in the flatness of it made her set down her needle and actually look at him, at the plain coat and the good boots, and the ring he wore turned inward, stone against his palm, which she had noticed at the fair, without knowing she had noticed it. She asked him, straight out, what his business at Ashcombe Hall actually was, since it did not appear to involve much investing, so far as she had observed, beyond eating a great many suppers with Mr. Crane. He told her, after a pause long enough that she understood he was deciding how much of the truth a stranger who had once kissed him for a stranger's reasons was owed. That he had reason to believe the estate's accounts, under Crane's management, were not what they were represented to be to the family that owned them, and that he had come to see for himself, before he made any accusation he could not prove. She thought of the bold, fresh ink sitting inside 11-year-old pages. She did not tell him about it yet. Some instinct, half fear and half something she would not admit to being fonder of, told her to hold that card a little longer, and instead she asked him whether his interest in the accounts had anything to do with the fact that Silas Crane appeared to be steering his niece toward Mr. Ash's dinner-table with the single-mindedness of a man steering a cart toward a bridge. Julian's mouth did the dry, almost smile again. "Cordelia Crane deserves a far better husband than the one her uncle is auditioning me for," he said. "And I have told him, twice, that I have no present intention of marrying anyone, which he has chosen both times not to hear." She laughed before she could stop herself, and he looked, for a moment, entirely undone by the sound of it, in a way that told her more than his careful sentences had. It was Bramwell, later that same week, who told her the part of the story she had not yet been able to fit together, arriving in the muniment room with a tray of bread and cheese Eleanor had not asked for, and did not, she suspected, actually need, and sitting herself down uninvited on the one good chair. "You've been asking after Mr. Ash," Bramwell said, not a question. Eleanor admitted she had wondered about him. Bramwell studied her for a long moment, the way she might study a seam to see whether it would hold a strain, and then she said, in the tone of a woman laying down a heavy thing she has carried further than she meant to, that she had known his grace since he was in short coats, that he had gone off the year his father died, and stayed off the country's radar entire, travelling under whatever name suited the district, because a man cannot learn how his own land is actually run if every soul in it is bowing before he's finished knocking. And Mr. Ash, Eleanor said, very carefully, her thumb finding the nick in her father's folder, without her permission. Bramwell looked at her for a long moment before she answered, and there was nothing dry in her face at all when she finally spoke. "A mended thing remembers where it broke," she said, "which is your father's saying, girl, not mine, though I've heard it enough these last weeks to have caught the habit of it. Julian Ash is the 8th Duke of Ashcombe, and has been since he was 21, and I'd wager the man himself doesn't yet know how he's going to tell you that, seeing as he came down to breakfast the morning after the fair looking like a man who'd been struck by lightning and rather enjoyed it. Knowing did not change the shape of him in her eyes so much as she had expected it to. It only explained things she had already half noticed and put down to ordinary strangeness, the way servants seemed to watch him without watching him, the way Crane's civility toward him carried an undertone of appetite rather than deference. What it changed, entirely and at once, was the shape of her own position. because a bookbinder's indentured daughter did not walk about a duke's house exchanging dry jokes with him over a drying table, whatever her hands might be worth. And she resolved, lying awake that night with the window open on air that still would not cool, to be plainer with him and stranger to him both, to close the small gap that had opened between them before it opened any further, and left her the only one who fell through it. It was a resolution she managed for exactly 4 days. He came to find her on the 5th, in the muniment room, at an hour Crane was known to keep for his own correspondence, and instead of the careful courtesies they had lately been trading, he simply stood across the table from her, and asked whether she meant to go on, pretending she had not noticed 40-year-old ink behaving like it was written last Tuesday. She told him then everything, the bold hand in the 11-year gap, Crane's smooth explanation about damp and iron gall pigment, the mend it and don't read it that had come out of his mouth in her own dead father's words. Julian listened with his hands flat on the table's edge, and when she finished he was quiet long enough that she thought she had said too much, and then he told her, in return, what he had not yet told anyone at Ashcombe Hall, that his father's solicitor, a careful, unremarkable man named Abel Norris, had written to him twice in his last year of life about discrepancies in the estate rent rolls he could not make the steward account for, and had died of a putrid fever before a third letter ever reached him, and that Norris's replacement, appointed by Crane himself within the month, had found nothing at all amiss in 6 years of looking. I have spent 4 years abroad telling myself Norris was an old man grown suspicious of a competent successor, Julian said. I did not want it to be true. My father trusted Crane. I have spent a good portion of my life trying to want the things my father wanted. She asked him, because it seemed the only honest question left, why he had not simply dismissed Crane the day he inherited and been done with it. Because a duke who dismisses a man on a feeling is a tyrant, he said, and a duke who dismisses a man on proof is only doing his duty. And I did not have proof. I had a feeling, and my father's whole life taught me that a feeling is not enough to ruin another man's. It was the closest thing to an apology for 4 years' delay that she would ever hear him make, and it cost him visibly to make it, in the particular way that honesty always seemed to cost this careful, plainly coated man more than it cost anyone else she knew. The obstacle, when it arrived properly, arrived in the form of the Dowager Duchess, Julian's grandmother, who came down from the Dower House at the end of that week with the specific purpose, Bramwell reported with some relish, of looking Eleanor over. Lady Augusta was small, upright, and possessed of eyes so pale a grey they seemed to have been left out in weather, and she conducted the interview standing in the muniment room doorway, as though sitting down might imply an intimacy she had not yet decided to grant. I am told you have been much in my grandson's company, she said, without preamble. Eleanor said that she had been given work in this house, and that the Duke had taken an interest in how it was progressing, which was true and also, she suspected, not remotely the answer the Dowager wanted. Lady Augusta's gaze went once around the room, at the ruined ledgers, at the bookbinder's plain wool dress, at the nicked bone folder sitting on the table where Eleanor had set it down. My grandson, she said, is engaged in all but the announcement to Lady Priscilla Hartwell, whose family's land marches with ours for 11 miles, and whose mother was my own dearest friend, and I will tell you plainly, since plain telling seems to be the fashion in this house of late, that a duke's affections are not entirely his own to spend, whatever his kisses may suggest he believes. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face, and then return to it hot. I have asked nothing of him, she said, and Lady Augusta studied her for a long moment with those pale, weathered eyes, and said, not unkindly, that wanting nothing had never yet stopped a house from falling down around a woman who stood too close to it, and left without waiting for a reply. Eleanor told Julian none of it, and did not need to, because he came to her within the hour, looking as though he had already had a version of the same conversation delivered to him directly. Priscilla Hartwell is a perfectly sensible woman who wishes to marry me exactly as much as I wish to marry her, he said, which is to say not at all, and my grandmother knows it, and presses the match anyway, because she has convinced herself that duty and desire are the same thing if you insist on it hard enough. Eleanor said that it was not her place to have an opinion on his grandmother's plans for him, and he said, with a directness that startled her more than any kiss had, that he had not asked whether it was her place, he had asked whether she wanted it to be. She did not answer that, not that evening, and the not answering sat between them like a held breath for 3 more days, until the evening Crane summoned Julian to dine early and alone, ostensibly to discuss a purchase of parcels along the river that Crane wished to make on the estate's behalf at what he called a most advantageous price, and Eleanor, left to her drying pages and her thoughts, made the discovery that would take the choice of speaking or staying silent entirely out of her hands. She had been rebinding a rent roll from 6 years back, the year of Norris's second letter, easing the old boards apart to replace a cracked spine, when the paste-down lining came free under her knife exactly the way a lining should not, too easily. As though someone had slid it in loose rather than glued it fast, and behind it, folded twice and gone soft as cloth with age, lay a second, thinner document that was not part of the ledger at all. She recognised her father's hand before she recognised anything else about it, the particular slant he gave his capitals, the small flourish under every H, because it was the hand that had signed her own name into the parish register the day she was christened, and for one long moment she could not make herself unfold the paper any further. Certain that whatever it held would cost her something she was not braced to pay. When she did unfold it, she found 2 things pressed together, where they had lain hidden for the better part of a year, her father's true and original bond to the estate, £3 and 10 shillings against binding materials, advanced him the winter before he died. His own signature plain and unhurried at the foot of it, nothing like the frightened scrawl Crane's £80 copy bore, and beneath it, in a smaller, more formal hand she did not know, a half-finished letter addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe, dated the spring before the old Duke's death, from Abel Norreys, laying out in careful, uphold sentences a pattern of rents collected twice over and recorded once, of land sold to a purchaser whose name, when Norris had troubled to look, led back through 2 clerks to Silas Crane's own brother-in-law. The letter broke off mid-sentence, the ink trailing away as though the writer had been interrupted and never returned to finish it, and across the bottom, in her father's hand again, added later and smaller, as if he had known exactly what he was risking by writing it at all, ran a single line. He came to me to rebind the muniment ledgers himself, and told me to make old paper look older, and new ink look old beside it, and I would not do the second thing, whatever he threatened me with. And so I have hidden what he wanted burned, where only a binder's daughter would ever think to look, and if you are reading this, Eleanor, then I did not live to tell you myself, and I am sorry for the debt he will have laid on you to keep you quiet. For there is no debt, there was never a debt worth £80, there was only ever a man protecting himself from an old man's letter and an old binder's conscience. She sat very still for a long time after that, the 2 documents open on the table beside her father's folder, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the shock of it, that her father had not died merely worn down by grief and a failing shop, as she had told herself for 8 months, but had died carrying a truth he was too frightened, or too proud, or too loving of her, to speak aloud while he lived, and had left it instead in the one place he trusted a person like Crane would never think to look. Inside the very lie Crane had ordered him to help construct. Mend it and don't read it. She understood now that he had been telling her, all those years at the workbench, exactly how to find whatever he might one day need her to find. She was still sitting with the papers in her lap when the door opened, and it was not Julian, and it was not Bramwell. "Well," Crane said, from the doorway, in a voice that had not yet decided whether to be pleasant. I did wonder how long that lining would hold. He came into the room unhurried, closing the door behind him with a care that frightened her far more than haste would have, and held out one hand, not urgently, the way a man holds out his hand for something he is entirely certain will be given him. Those documents belong to the estate's private history, Miss Hartley, and are no business of amending clerks, whatever sentimental attachment you may feel to your father's handwriting. She did not give them to him. I know what my father's bond actually was, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt it had any right to. I know what you told me it was. Crane's smile arrived, on schedule, half a second before his eyes joined it, and he said that grief made young women fanciful, that a smudged old scrap proved nothing a court would credit against 6 years of properly kept books, and that she would do well to consider what became of women who accused men of consequence of things they could not prove, particularly women already bound to those men by a debt that remained, whatever she believed about its origin, entirely enforceable so long as his copy of the bond was the only one any magistrate would ever see. He held out his hand again. "Give them to me, and I will forget this whole unfortunate afternoon. Forgive what remains of the year's bond, and see you sent home with a character good enough to find work anywhere in the county." It was, she understood, the kindest offer he had made her since the funeral, and it was built entirely on her silence, and she thought of her father writing that last small line, knowing he might never live to finish the sentence above it, and found she could not make her hand open. "I would rather keep the truth and the debt both," she said, "than give up the truth and be forgiven a lie." Crane's face did not change, quite, but something behind it went very cold, the particular coldness of a man recalculating a sum that has just come out wrong twice in 1 week, and it was in that silence, with neither of them moving, that the door opened again, and Thomas Whitlock stepped into it, having come, he would explain much later, to return a book he had borrowed from the muniment room's shelves months before, and never thought to give back, and finding instead a scene he was plainly not meant to see, a steward with his hand still outstretched, and a woman he had once loved gripping 2 old papers to her chest as though they were the only solid things left in the room. Thomas did not understand what he had walked into, not fully, not that day, but he understood enough to plant himself in the doorway and ask, mildly, whether he had come at an inconvenient time, in a tone that made plain he did not much care whether the answer was yes. Crane recovered his civility faster than Eleanor would have believed possible, remarking that Miss Hartley had found some old family papers among the ruined ledgers, and that he had merely been advising her on their proper disposal, and Thomas said, without moving from the doorway, that he would be glad to help her decide what to do with them himself, since he understood a little of estate law from his own father's dealings. And Crane, faced with 2 witnesses where he had expected none, took his leave with a bow so correct it amounted to an insult, and told Eleanor, on his way out, that he trusted she would think carefully before doing anything rash with papers whose provenance she could not prove to anyone's satisfaction but her own. When he had gone, Thomas crossed the room and looked at what she held, and read it twice, his face going through several things at once, old affection and old guilt, and, beneath both, a plain professional interest that surprised her. My father kept accounts of every physic he ever dispensed, in 3 different inks over 30 years, he said, turning the ledger page toward the window's last light, and I could tell you which ink was mixed before the year 8, and which after, because the newer blue holds its colour, and the old logwood browns within a decade, and whoever wrote these later entries used the newer blue in a book that claims to be older than the dye itself. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, the way a man offers a gift he is not certain will be welcome, and Eleanor understood that whatever had gone cold and distant between them these last months, he had just handed her, without being asked, the one thing that would turn her father's hidden letter from a grieving man's accusation into a provable fact. She did not have time to thank him properly before Julian found them both there, having been told by a breathless Cordelia that Uncle Silas had gone up to his room, white as a sheet, and locked the door, and the sight of Thomas Whitlock standing close beside Eleanor over the ledger sent something shuttered and unreadable across his face before he mastered it. She showed him what she had found, both of them talking over each other in their haste to explain it, Thomas's account of the ink, and Eleanor's account of her father's line at the bottom of the letter. And Julian read it standing very still, and when he reached her father's final sentence, the one written smaller, added after, he did not speak for a long moment, and when he did his voice had gone rough in a way she had not heard from him before. He died protecting a truth that was never even his to protect, Julian said. He died protecting you. It should have been the moment everything turned towards safety, and instead it was the moment Crane, watching from the gallery above the hall, where none of them had thought to look, understood that the evidence he had spent 5 years burying had been found by exactly the one pair of hands in the house trained to notice it, and set in motion, before nightfall, the one weapon he still had left, which was not the false bond at all, but the true one Eleanor's own service still bound her to, and the quiet word he sent up to the dowager that her grandson had been discovered alone with a bound servant of the house over stolen private papers, in language calculated to make the truth sound exactly like the scandal it was not. The dowager came down before breakfast the next morning, and the storm that had been building all week over the dry fields broke at almost the same hour, so that her carriage arrived streaked with the first rain Wren's Cross had seen in 11 weeks, and she conducted the interview in the library, with the fire lit against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She did not raise her voice, not once, which frightened Eleanor far more than shouting would have. "I am told," Lady Augusta said, "that you have been found alone with my grandson over papers whose authenticity nobody but yourself can vouch for, papers that happen, most conveniently, to accuse the one man who has run this estate honestly for 20 years. She turned to Julian, and I am told you defended her doing so with a warmth that has already reached the servants' hall, which means it will reach Priscilla Hartwell's mother by Sunday." Julian said, evenly, that the papers were not convenient, they were true, and that Thomas Whitlock's own knowledge of ink and dye would bear out every word of it before any magistrate in the county. And Lady Augusta said that magistrates were slower and colder than grandmothers, and that in the meantime the damage to the family's name would already be done. Whatever the eventual verdict, it was Crane, summoned to answer for himself, who offered the way out that very afternoon, standing in the library with his hands clasped behind his back exactly as he had stood over Eleanor's drying table on her first morning at the Hall, entirely composed again, the fright of the night before folded away somewhere she could not see. "There need be no scandal at all," he said, "if Miss Hartley will simply agree that the papers she found were incomplete, inconclusive, open to more than one reading, as indeed they are, and if she will accept a full release from her bond and a generous character in exchange for her discretion, and if his Grace will consider the matter of my accounts closed as a courtesy to a family that has employed mine faithfully for 3 generations." It was, Eleanor understood, watching him make the offer with such reasonable wounded dignity, a monstrous thing dressed as a kindness, and she understood too that a version of herself who had not spent a year mending things her father taught her never to leave half-repaired might have taken it, might have gone home quietly with her character intact, and let the truth stay folded inside a ruined spine, where it had waited 8 months already, and could wait forever. "I will not call it inconclusive," she said, into the silence that followed Crane's offer, "because it is not, and I did not spend a year of my life, and my father did not spend the last of his protecting a truth, so that I could trade it for my own comfort the first time comfort was offered." Crane's expression did not change, but something in his stillness did. The stillness of a man who has just watched his last reasonable card be declined. It was Julian who ended the interview, quietly, telling his grandmother that the estate's accounts would be laid open at the quarter-day settling 3 days hence, before the tenants and the trustees, and whichever magistrate the Dowager cared to send for, and that whatever the papers showed, they would show it in the open, in daylight, before witnesses, and not in a library with the curtains drawn. He did not look at Eleanor as he said it, and that, more than anything Crane had offered, was what frightened her, because it had the sound of a man setting his own house in order before doing something he expected to cost him. He came to find her that night in the muniment room, where she had gone because it was the only place in the house that still felt entirely hers, and told her, without preamble, that she should go home to Wren's Cross until the quarter-day was past. "It is not safe for you here while Crane is still under this roof, and still capable of doing you harm before the truth can be made public," he said. "And I would rather you were 3 miles off and unreachable than 1 floor above him, and within his grasp." She heard, in the careful evenness of it, only the sound of a door closing, the same door the Dowager and Priscilla Hartwell, and the whole weight of what he was had been standing behind all along, and she told him, her voice colder than she meant it to be, that she understood perfectly, that a duke's affections were not entirely his own to spend, as she had been told already once this week, and that she would save them both the trouble of pretending otherwise. He said her name, once, and reached for her hand, and she stepped back before he could take it, because she did not trust herself, in that moment, to be touched, and remain as certain of her own dignity as she needed to be. She left for Wren's Cross before first light, walking the 3 miles in a rain that had not yet spent itself, her father's folder in her pocket, and both documents sewn now into the lining of her own cloak, where no one, she had decided, would ever again find them by accident. And she did not look back at the gatehouse arch she had first walked under a year ago as a debtor, and was now walking away from as something she did not have a word for. Not servant, not guest, not anything Julian Asher's careful goodbyes had left room for her to be. The quarter-day settling was held in the great hall of Ashcombe Hall 3 mornings later, under a sky rinsed so clean by the storm that the light coming through the tall windows had a hard, washed brightness Eleanor had not seen over the county in months, and she stood at the back of the room among the tenants, because Bramwell had sent word the night before. In a hand Eleanor did not know Bramwell possessed, that she was needed, and that whatever pride she had left ought to be set aside for one morning in favour of finishing what her father started. The hall filled slowly with tenant families in their good coats, with the magistrate from Kettleworth seated at a table set up before the cold hearth, with the dowager upright in the best chair, and Cordelia beside her looking, for once entirely without chatter, and with Thomas Whitlock standing near the door, with a leather case under his arm that Eleanor understood, from the set of his shoulders, to contain something he had worked through the night to finish. Crane stood near the magistrate's table with the same composed civility he had worn through every scene Eleanor had watched him perform, and it was only when Julian came in, last, dressed plainly as he had been at the fair, and took his place not at the head of the room, but beside the magistrate, as a witness rather than as a judge, that the room's whole temperature seemed to change. Because half the tenants in it were only now, from the particular way the dowager's steward addressed him, working out who Mr. Ashe had actually been all along. The accounts were read first, in the ordinary dry way of accounts, 6 years of rents and repairs, and the river parcel purchase Crane had lately pressed for, and it was Julian who asked, when the reading reached the year of Norreys's second letter, whether the original bonds and correspondence for that year might be produced alongside the fair copies the steward's office had supplied. Crane said that some original papers had been lost in the spring flood, which was, he said, precisely why Miss Hartley had been engaged to mend what remained. It was the opening Eleanor had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it, and she stepped forward from among the tenant families with both documents drawn from the lining of her cloak, and asked the magistrate's leave to read 2 papers aloud, so that everyone in the room might hear the same words at the same moment, and no one afterward could claim to have heard a different account of them than his neighbour. She read her father's true bond first, £3 and 10 shillings, his own steady signature at the foot of it, and set beside it, for anyone with eyes, Crane's fair copy claiming 80, and a murmur went through the tenant benches that had the particular weight of people recognising a wrong they had half suspected in their own accounts for years, but never had the words or the standing to say. Aloud. Then she read Norris's unfinished letter, every appalled careful sentence of it, the rents collected twice and recorded once, the river land sold on to Crane's own brother-in-law, under a name 3 clerks removed, and her voice did not break until she reached her father's final line, added smaller, written by a man who feared he would not live to explain it himself, and there she stopped, because reading her own father's grief aloud, in a room full of strangers, cost her something she had not accounted for, and it was Thomas, not Julian, who stepped forward in the pause and opened his leather case, and laid 3 pages of his own careful notation on the magistrate's table, showing in plain, patient language that the ink in the disputed ledger entries contained a dye not manufactured until 4 years after the date those entries claimed, so that whatever else was in doubt, the ledgers themselves could no longer be called anything but forgeries. It was in the silence after that, the whole hall's attention fixed on the table where the papers lay, that Crane made his single mistake, lunging forward with a suddenness that startled even the magistrate, his hand closing on the unfinished letter as though he meant to feed it to the cold hearth behind him, and it was that one unconsidered movement, more than any column of figures. That told every soul in the hall everything the documents had only been arguing. He was stopped before he reached the fire, Thomas's hand closing over his wrist without violence, only firmness, and Crane stood very still afterward, breathing hard, his composure gone entirely for the first time Eleanor had ever seen it slip. And when he spoke again, it was not to the magistrate at all, but low, almost to himself, that his son had owed men in London sums he could not have paid honestly in 100 years of a steward's salary, and that he had told himself the first time that he would put it right the moment the boy's debts were cleared, and had never once found the moment to stop. It was not an excuse Eleanor could forgive him, not fully, not that morning, but she found. Watching him stand there, stripped of every careful smile he had ever given her, that she did not want him destroyed either, only finished. And it was Julian who said, quietly into the hush that followed, that Mr. Crane would leave the county by Michaelmas, with what remained of his own name, and nothing else of the estates, and that the tenants he had cheated would have their true rents restored from that day forward, and Crane, hearing it, only nodded once, an old man's nod, and asked, with what dignity he had left, whether he might be permitted to say good-bye to his niece in private before he went, and Julian, after a moment, said that he might. The hall emptied slowly after that, tenants filing out into the washed bright morning, still talking low among themselves, the magistrate gathering his papers, Cordelia led away by Bramwell with her face white and set. And it was some time before Eleanor realised that she and Julian had been left almost entirely alone at the cold hearth, her father's 2 documents still lying on the table between them, where the whole county had just heard them read aloud. "I sent you away," Julian said, before she could speak first, "because I thought I was protecting you from him, and I told myself that was the whole of my reason. And it was not the whole of my reason, and I have had 3 days in the rain to be ashamed of the part I left out." She asked him, because she had earned the right to ask it plainly, what part that was. "That I was afraid," he said, "of asking you to stand beside a life that would cost you your own name the moment you took mine, of watching you become nothing more than a duchess who once mended paper, and I told myself sending you home was mercy, when it was only ever fear wearing Mercy's coat, the same coat my grandmother's whole argument has been wearing all along." She did not answer at once, and the not answering this time was not refusal, but the shape of a woman deciding exactly what she would and would not accept before she said yes to anything. "If I stay," she said finally, "I stay as myself. My father's name is cleared in the parish register this week, not quietly, not as a favour, but as the plain record it always should have been. I keep the bindery under my own name, and I mend what I choose to mend, duchess or not. And whatever land Crane took from those tenants under a false name goes back to them outright, not folded into the estate as a kindness we get to feel good about. Those are my terms," she said, "and I will not soften them for the sake of being agreeable." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face came fully undone at last, the last of the careful composure he had worn since the cider stall giving way entirely. "Those are not terms I need persuading to accept," he said. "Those are simply what should have been true already. And I am glad it took you saying it plainly for me to be ashamed I had not said it first." He took her hand then, the one still faintly marked from an old habit of pressing a bone-folder's nicked corner into her own palm, and turned the plain ring on his fingerstone outward for the first time since she had known him, and told her that he did not care what his grandmother's plans for Priscilla Hartwell had been, that Priscilla herself, it transpired, had been quietly in love with a curate in her own parish for 2 years, and would likely thank them both for releasing her from an engagement neither party had ever wanted, and that the only marriage he intended to make was one where a woman had named her own conditions before she agreed to anything at all. Lady Augusta, told of it that same week, said only, after a long silence in which she looked at Eleanor with those pale weathered eyes, as though reading a ledger she had previously misjudged, that she supposed a woman who would not be moved by a duke's grandmother had probably earned the right to be his wife, and that she had judged the girl's hands too quickly and her name too kindly, and that she would not make that mistake twice. It was the closest thing to an apology Eleanor would ever hear from her, and it was, in its plain way, entirely sufficient. They were married the following spring, in the same small church at Wren's Cross where Eleanor had once stood over her father's grave with a bone folder pressed hard enough into her palm to leave a mark, and the emblem itself, worn nearly smooth after 2 years of anxious thumbs, now sat mounted in a thin band of silver on a ribbon at her throat, its nicked corner left exactly as it had always been, because Julian had told the silversmith, when he commissioned it, that the nick was the whole point, and was not, under any circumstance, to be smoothed away. A year on from the quarter-day settling, the Michaelmas fair came round again to Wren's Cross, the drought long since broken, the fields gone properly green, the heron that had fished the mill-pond through every season of that hard year, still working the shallows in the same unhurried, ordinary way it always had, as though none of what had happened to the people who lived nearby had been any business of its own. Eleanor stood again at the cider stall, a year to the week from the evening she had begged a stranger for a kiss, and this time it was a girl of perhaps 12, an apprentice Eleanor had lately taken on from the parish school, small-handed and quick, who tugged at her sleeve to ask whether it was true that the Duchess had once mended books for a living before she married the Duke, and Eleanor said that she still did, thank you, marriage having changed a great many things about her circumstances and none whatsoever about her trade. Julian found them there a few minutes later, having come from the dancing to fetch his wife, and Thomas Whitlock was among the dancers with a doctor's daughter from Kettleworth, on his arm, laughing with his whole face in a way Eleanor was glad, without any lingering ache at all, to see. "Kiss me," Eleanor said to her husband, at the same cider stall, in the same falling light, make him jealous, and nodded toward the apprentice girl watching them both with round, delighted eyes. "There is no him to make jealous this time," Julian said, setting his hand over hers where it rested on the stall's worn wood. "There never really was," she said, "only ever you." And let him kiss her anyway, slowly, unhurried, entirely without performance, while the apprentice girl pretended not to watch and watched anyway, and the heron lifted once off the mill-pond's still water and settled again a little further along the bank, and that is where we will leave them, in the gold and ordinary light of a fair that had finally, after everything, become just a fair again. If tonight's story kept you a little longer by the fire than you meant to stay, you are exactly the kind of listener it was told for, and I hope Eleanor's small nicked folder, carried whole through every hard year into the one good one, is the piece you carry out with you. Tell us in the comments which moment held you closest, whether it was a father's last hidden line, or a heron minding its own water while everything else changed. And if you would like another night like this one, settle in and subscribe to digestah_name_e-h, so you never miss the next tale lit and waiting for you. The kettle is already on for next time. Sleep gently, and be kind to whoever you find beside your own fire.